Despite a disappointing end, 2024 was still, at least in my opinion, a pretty great year for the Baltimore Orioles. A lot of wins, a lot of cool moments, some new leadership as well. We will draft our favorite Orioles things from 2024 with Paul Mancano of the Baltimore Banner coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, December 27th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. We've got a guest who will be with us here in just a moment. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are almost here, but it's not too late to get in on the regular season action with FanDuel, because right now, new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So let's bring in our guest. He's been on this podcast before. He has been voted most likely Locked On Orioles guest to show up on your TikTok feed. He is Paul Mancano of the Baltimore Banner. And Paul, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to try to be louder than the leaf blower in the background of your house.
Yeah, let's address the elephant in the room. They come and do some blowing of the leaves and whatnot, once every about 2 weeks. Sometimes they don't even come in December, especially if there's snow on the ground. So, 10:30 a.m. on a Friday when we plan to record this, of course, is the time that they show up. I'm not just talking about in my neighborhood. I'm talking about right outside my house. Where I record is right next to a window, which is making it worse. And here we are. So if you hear the low buzz as I'm talking, it just means that the wonderful people who are blowing the leaves outside of my community here in the great city of Baltimore, Maryland, are making their first appearance on the Locked On Orioles podcast. But Paul, you are here today because we wanted to recap 2024. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. I know that this season kind of ended with a sour taste. It was a bad finish to the year. The Orioles were once again swept out of the playoffs. They scored one run in 2 games in the wild card series against the Royals. But there were still a lot of great things to look back to in 2024. It was back-to-back playoff berths for the first time since the 90s for the Orioles. I mean, that's something to celebrate. There are still a lot of great things to look forward to in 2025, but we're going to do a draft here. Now, the plan is there are not a lot of rules to this draft, and you all listening or watching at home can draft your own moments here. It is just Orioles things of calendar year 2024. If it happened between January 1st and I guess today of 2024, and it involved the Orioles, whether it's a game, a moment, a home run, a transaction, a vibe, an entire overarching theme, whatever it may be, you can draft it. And we're each going to take 5 and kind of talk about what those moments meant and how they fit in to the story of the Orioles season. Paul, are we feeling good about the very open-ended rules of this draft?
Yeah, I was a little upset that the signing of David Banuelos and Michael Perez didn't quite count because those were made on December 30th, 2023. So the Orioles did not make that move in the year 2024, and they're not available to draft. But unfortunately, that's not in there, but I'll have plenty of other stuff in there. Don't worry.
Yeah, you seem to think I'm not going to draft something having to do with David Banuelos, but the other weird part is this is a deep cut, but Michael Perez has been in the big leagues for a few seasons. Who would have thought that David Banuelos would be the one who did appear in a big league game?
True.
And Michael Perez did not for the Orioles this year. But that is about 172nd probably on the list of things that you might draft in this draft. Paul, you are the guest. So I am going to let you go first. Ooh. And that basically gives you the board to pick your favorite Orioles thing from 2024. So go ahead.
Sure. I'll keep it pretty simple and obvious to start. And I'm going to go with leadoff Gunnar Henderson. Gunnar Henderson hitting out of the leadoff spot was sort of viewed by many coming into the season when he started doing it as not necessarily an experiment, but around baseball, do you always hit your best hitter first? It's more of a new age kind of thing because you give him as many times through the lineup as possible, but you also, the first time he comes up to bat, he's not going to be batting with anybody on base. And that means that a lot of his home runs are going to be solo home runs. But the Orioles did it to start the year. They did it for most of the year, and it drew incredible results. He finished the year second best in weighted runs created plus. I know you love the advanced stats, Connor, so I had to bring one out here. Of any leadoff hitter in baseball, save Shohei Ohtani with a minimum 100 plate appearances. That's better than Francisco Lindor, who hit leadoff a lot this year for the Mets. Better than Kyle Schwarber, who broke the record for most leadoff home runs this year. Better than Mookie Betts, who hit a lot of leadoff. Gunnar hit 10 leadoff home runs. So first batter of the game, he's starting it off with the Orioles with a 1-0 lead. That's tied for 11th in baseball history in a single season. And it's his second full big league season. And the Orioles threw a lot of responsibility on his plate, and he took it and ran with it. So leadoff Gunnar is my first overall pick.
Yeah, it was something that they changed a little bit down the stretch. We saw like a little bit more Colton Cowser in that spot later in the year. And I think that was because when the Orioles offense wasn't humming, they were like, well, Gunnar's still hitting. And if he's going to be the one guy to hit the ball out of the park, let's try and have Westberg, Cowser, Rutschman, somebody on ahead of him to get a couple runs on the board when they were really struggling. But the funny part is, even early in the season, you saw a lot of arguments. Oh, Gunnar's on pace to hit 40 plus homers. Why are we wasting all his home runs as solo shots? Well, it was like this offense was clicking on all cylinders in the first half with him in a leadoff spot. So it was almost like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I know the Orioles, especially in 2023, experimented with Adley Rutschman in that role. And despite being the top on base guy, the Orioles really didn't. I know Brandon Hyde talked about not loving him have to like sprint back and get the catcher's gear off and hit leadoff after catching the top of the first in a home game, which at first kind of sounds silly, but then you think about it. And as someone who caught in baseball for 10 years, obviously not the professional level, but it's like, yeah, I would have hated having to do that. Catch the whole first inning. And then it's like, hey, you're up. And now there's a pitch clock. So you got to sprint in there,
right,
get the gear off and run up there. So Gunnar ended up being a perfect fit. And I had something on my big board for this draft that wasn't like in my top 5. So it wasn't something I was going to draft immediately, but I'm going to just throw it out there now. Not just him hitting leadoff, but the bat flips on walks from Gunnar Henderson is something I thought about drafting in this draft. And I'll just throw it out there here. This is not going to be my first pick. This is just an add-on to yours. First of all, he jumped up to almost an 11% walk rate this year. Like, he was walking a good amount. Some of it was because pitchers were scared of him and he was getting on base early in games because they didn't want to give up the leadoff homer. And instead they were fine with giving up the leadoff walk. But Paul, he seemed to get angrier and angrier as the season went on with the way he would chuck his bat towards the Oriole dugout.
Yeah, it was something that we hardly noticed to start the year. It seemed more like a fiery kind of excitement moment. And then it seemed to be more frustration and anger that he couldn't swing the bat, I guess. But it became such a bit, and I'm sure he became aware of it, and he leaned into it. And I give him a lot of credit for that. I also want to throw out there, you talk about the different guys that the Orioles tried in that leadoff spot. Lest we forget, the penultimate regular season game, the Orioles had Jackson Holliday hit leadoff, something that he did a lot in the minor leagues. I'm not saying the Orioles are going to do that a whole lot in 2025, but the way he was hitting to close out the season, I don't know, maybe a possibility.
I think ultimately that's the plan. I'd maybe target 2026 for when that becomes kind of the full plan, but I do think that's in the cards moving forward. All right, so I will take my first pick, my official first pick, and I will go with a moment that we were actually together for in person. Yes, me and Paul are friends outside of doing this podcast together today. I will take what I think was the best in-game moment of the year, and I will take Anthony Santander's grand slam against the Houston Astros in August. What a moment it was, because although it didn't exactly spark the Orioles moving forward, like they played like 500 ball over the next week, I went back and looked. This was on August 23rd. The Orioles were trailing 5-2 in the 8th inning. They had already lost a game to the Astros, like a stinker in the first game of that 4-game series. They were not playing good baseball in August. They were down Westberg. They were down all these guys. They were bringing in the Emmanuel Riveras and Levon Sotos of the world just to try and put together an offense that was really, really struggling. And it was an odd inning where the Orioles started to rally, and then there was this weird ground ball back to the pitcher where Brian Abreu threw to third base for some reason, and Colton Cowser dove back in safely, which ended up loading the bases. And then Santander just gets a 2-1 pitch that seemed like a foot above the strike zone, and a high fastball, which is the pitch he struggles against the most, and takes it out to right center field for a go-ahead grand slam. And I mentioned we were together is that I was watching the game on my phone as we sat outside in Fed Hill, and I heard the fireworks going off as it was still a 2-1 count on my phone. And I said, did Santander just hit a grand slam? Because you heard the roar of it was a good Friday night, I think maybe giveaway crowd against the Astros. You hear the fireworks, you hear the roar, and then I see what happens. And again, did it spark them moving forward? Not really. They did pick up a really good win the next day over the Astros as well. But other than that, it didn't really turn the season around like we thought it might. But I think that is the most memorable on-field moment from the season. The O's were 2-5 in their previous 7 games going into that one. They were not playing well. And the win probability added, the WPA, was plus 0.533, basically swung their winning percentage in that game by 53%, which was the biggest swing by WPA of any Oriole this season. So to me, that was the coolest on-field moment. And if I'm going to go back and watch one highlight from 2024 in the years to come, it will be that swing from Santander.
Yeah, you felt the home crowd at that point. It was at that point in the year, like you said, Connor, where fans were getting just a little restless. You know, the offense wasn't producing quite as well. The injuries were piling up. And you leave it to the veteran to pull them out of their doldrums like he had done so many times before. I mean, that was one of the things that, you know, I think the Orioles, assuming he signs elsewhere this offseason, they'll miss about Anthony Santander is he had the slow heartbeat. He was the veteran in the room. You know who got the win in that game, by the way, Connor?
Was it Birch Smith?
It was Craig Kimbrell pitching in the 8th inning, and the save went to Sir Anthony Dominguez. So just a interesting time capsule of a game. You were hoping, and I think a lot of fans were hoping after that would be the spark that would get the Orioles back on track, and it never really played out that way. And a lot of it was due to the fact that they were still without all those guys in the lineup, like Mancano and Westberg. But at that point, it definitely was a breath of fresh air. It was a moment of relief, and you could feel everybody in the stadium finally say, all right, this is the team we saw in the first half. Let's believe in this group again. This is the group that we think can win the World Series. It was a great moment.
All right, pick number 2 from you, Paul.
All right, I'm going to go with another great on-field moment from earlier in the season. And I'm going to go with the James McCann broken nose game, which I'm sure you had on your list as well somewhere.
Absolutely.
Not because I wish any harm on anybody. And certainly James McCann, I'm sure, will remember that game fondly, but will also remember a lot of pain in that game because it looked awfully painful when he took 95 to the schnoz in the first inning of a doubleheader on July 29th. And he stayed in the game to catch the rest of the 8 innings remaining. Orioles go on to win 11-5. The reason he did it, of course, was because Adley Rutschman was scheduled to catch the second game of that doubleheader, and he didn't want Adley to have to catch 9 innings in the nightcap and 8 innings in the day game. A phenomenal play. I know James McCann has, certainly took a lot of heat from Orioles fans this year because his offense was not spectacular and his walk rate was low. And, there were times where he came up small, and especially in the playoffs at the plate, his 2 playoff plate appearances did not go well. But James McCann is a veteran leader. You can't say anything bad about who he was in the clubhouse, who he was as a leader to his teammates. And as backup catchers go, I still say James McCann is one of the best and was one of the best in his 2 years in Baltimore. And I'm glad he got to have kind of a signature moment as an Oriole because the sight of the blood pouring out of his face and then him getting back in the batter's box and then him talking to the media after the game just goes to show how tough that dude is.
That was a ridiculous moment. It's one of the more just like gruesome moments I remember watching live in an Orioles game. And obviously the big part was, first inning of a doubleheader. It's like, what are we going to do if James McCann comes out of this game? And for as long as he was down, I mean, it was 10 plus minutes. It felt like that he was down, getting looked at by Brian Ebel and the training staff. And the fact that he was even walking to first base, I was like, all right, this is just for show. He's going to come out of the game. And no, he's going to stay in the game. And at some point I thought, okay, he's toughing it out at first base. As soon as his inning ends and he puts the gear back on and he catches the top of the second, he's going to realize I cannot do this. And then the top of the third came and he was right back out there behind home plate. And it was just like, this guy's ridiculous. And he didn't produce a lot. And there were only a few, he had the big weekend against the Mets in 2023 that was cool for him. And he had the walk-off against the Royals earlier this year, which had to have been cool. But there wasn't a lot of signature moments. It's a backup catcher. There's generally not a lot of signature moments. And he's another guy like Santander in that we're assuming at this point he's not back. The Orioles have already signed Gary Sanchez. They've kind of moved on to their next backup catcher. McCann is still a free agent. I think Orioles fans will miss him in much different ways than they will Anthony Santander, and especially in production. But I think he was very good for that role behind Adley Rutschman for the last 2 years. The Mets basically paid his salary for the last 2 years for him to be the Orioles' backup catcher, and that was an absurd moment that I think a lot of people certainly remember. I am going to move on to my number 2 pick, and I'm going to take the first transaction of this draft, and I'm going to take the Orioles trade for Corbin Burnes, because you can't make a bigger splash. I don't think there was much of a bigger splash in this calendar year. Was the Juan Soto trade in 2023 or 2024?
Ooh, I don't recall.
Well, either way, in terms of relating to the Orioles, there is not a bigger splash than trading for Corbin Burnes. February 1st of 2024, the Orioles send Joey Ortiz, DL Hall, and a compensation pick to Milwaukee for Burnes, who, despite how well Kyle Bradish pitched in 2023, and I'm the leader of the Bradish heads, that gave the Orioles their first true ace since Mike Mussina, and he pitched like it this year. And yeah, there was some stumbles in August, and he wasn't the same kind of strikeout pitcher he had been in the past with Milwaukee, but he was a true number 1 ace. He showed that pitching into the 9th inning. Basically, he never does that, and he did that, giving up 1 run in that postseason start in Game 1 of the Wild Card Series. He was everything the Orioles could have asked for in that deal, and he is still a free agent, and I wouldn't say the Orioles are the favorites to bring him back, but I think there's still at least a little bit of hope as we record here right at the end of December that, if he's not getting the deal he wants, he could take a shorter-term deal with opt-outs and big money, and maybe that means he could come back to Baltimore. But even if he does sign elsewhere, and all the Orioles get out of it is 1 good season and a compensation pick for the qualifying offer for giving up a pick and 2 players they thought were a big part of their future in DL Hall and Joey Ortiz, I still do that trade 10 times out of 10 because it just gave the Orioles something they hadn't had since basically the late 90s. And that propelled this team, at least helped them back to the postseason. And there hadn't been a starter that other teams feared like that in an Oriole uniform in so long. And it was refreshing to have that, and to see what he did on opening day and just followed up for the rest of the year was awesome.
Yeah, and at the winter meetings a couple of weeks ago, Mike Elias was talking to the media, and he was talking about maybe making an acquisition to help the starting rotation now. And he said, look at what we did last year. Not every team can go out and get an ace in the trade market or in free agency, and we did. And he kind of took a slight victory lap on it, and it's deserved because that was probably, the best. Corbin Burnes might have been the best pitcher to change teams last offseason. And the Orioles gave up, a potential future starter in DL Hall, though he struggled with injuries. And Joey Ortiz, I think, is going to be a solid player. Guess he's probably going to play shortstop now for the Brewers in 2025 and could do it for several years. But you trade that draft pick that you probably could be getting back if he signs elsewhere because you gave him the offer for this past offseason, and then he signs elsewhere. You could get that draft pick back. And I think the important thing also to consider here is patience. That deal happened on February 1st, and we are sitting here on, in late December with less than a week left in the calendar year. And I think Orioles fans are seemingly a little frustrated with the Orioles' inability to add to their rotation and get an ace, whether it's Corbin Burnes or somebody else to replace him. They still have a lot of time before spring training. I know it may not seem like it, but a lot of guys still out there. And even if they don't get one in free agency, they could get one via trade. And it could happen close to spring training, could happen in spring training. So give them some time. And I also think the fact that the Orioles showed that they were willing to trade a draft pick in that deal shows that, hey, maybe, the Orioles are more willing to sign somebody to a qualifying offer than we've seen previously reported. Because yes, you lose a draft pick in that instance if you sign somebody who's been offered and turned down a qualifying offer from another team. But the Orioles are shown they can trade draft picks. They're okay with parting with draft picks if the talent is just that good. Mike Elias said as much at the winter meetings as well. So a couple lessons to be learned from that Corbin Burnes trade that I think Orioles fans can take into this offseason.
And I just looked it up. The Juan Soto trade from the Padres to the Yankees was December of 2023. So vindicated in Corbin Burnes was the best trade made by any team in
Absolutely.
2024. We're going to continue on with our draft, but first we got to take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsors. This episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are almost here, but it's not too late to get in on the regular season action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. FanDuel has so many ways for you to pick up a W. Whether it's betting on which players will score a touchdown or how many points each team will score, it can be thrilling. So just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That is FanDuel.com for your chance at $250 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So we are here with Paul Mancano of the Baltimore Banner. We are drafting our favorite Orioles things of 2024. And so far, a recap, Paul, your top two picks were?
They were leadoff Gunnar Henderson and the James McCann broken nose game.
And I have taken the Anthony Santander Grand Slam against the Astros and the Orioles trading for Corbin Burnes. Paul, it's over to you for your number 3 pick in our draft.
I'm going to pick another on-field moment here, and I'm going to go with Jackson Holliday's Grand Slam, which occurred on July 31st, just after the trade deadline. And it was a incredible moment for him personally, and it was an incredible moment for Orioles fans to get a glimpse of who he can be in the future. It was his first big league homer. It was on a beautiful day, and he crushed it to put it onto Utah Street, basically, onto the flag court. And it was a exciting moment for a lot of reasons. You know, the Orioles had just made a bunch of transactions at the trade deadline, and this is the second opportunity in the big leagues for Jackson Holliday. We all know the first one did not go very well. He gets sent back down to AAA, something that not a lot of people expected the Orioles to do. He gets called back up, and he takes the most, he makes the most of the opportunity that he's given. And the final couple months of the season, no, he didn't play lights out baseball, but he showed that he is a whole lot better and a whole lot more ready for big league baseball than he was in his first big league stint. So a thrilling moment. And the guys that were on base for that grand slam in the 5th inning against the Blue Jays were Jordan Westburg, Ryan Mountcastle, and Cedric Mullins. And it's a shame that we just did not get to see an infield of Mountcastle, Holliday, and Westburg enough this year, with Gunnar at shortstop, of course, because once those guys went down, once we lost, Ryan Mountcastle for a little bit, Jordan Westburg, obviously, for a long time, we'll get that group, I think, on the field a lot more often in 2025. And I'm excited to see what that group can produce.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, that was his hardest hit ball of the year, 109.2 off the bat. Unsurprisingly, it was his longest home run of the year, 439 feet, just demolishing kind of a cement mixer 0-2 slider in the middle of the plate. And that was the little glimpse. And we saw more glimpses later in the year as well. I mentioned the Santander Grand Slam the day after that. Jackson Holliday had the big swing, the 3-run double to put the Orioles ahead in that next game they won against Houston. And he had some big moments, more to come, obviously, but that was the coolest and the biggest, and the one where it was like, that was even more released than him finally getting his first hit against Milwaukee. That was that first hit against Milwaukee was cool to finally get it, but that was a dribbler through the right side for a single. Like, this was the Jackson Holliday and what we absolutely know he can do. I'm going to go to number 3. This is the first one I'm going to take like a more overarching full season approach to one of these picks. I'm going to take everything about Albert Suarez as my 3rd pick in this draft. What else can you say about this 34-year-old right-hander who the Orioles signed to a minor league deal after pitching in Japan and Korea, had gotten a cup of coffee with the Giants in 2016 and 2017. He just looks like the classic depth you bring in the offseason, right? You take a flyer on a guy, you change a little bit, he gives you some innings in Norfolk. Maybe he makes a spot start or two for you during the regular season just to help you out. And then we see him in spring training against the Phillies, and it's like, wow, okay. Who's this guy? 6-7 strikeouts, but it's spring training. He doesn't make the opening day roster. But then we see him come up in April, and all of a sudden, he makes that first start, and he looks really good, and it just continues and continues. And there were a couple moments where it was like, he's not amazing. They could use the roster spot, but it's like, you don't want to DFA Albert Suarez. See, you don't want another team to get their hands on him. And all of a sudden, he kind of saved the Orioles pitching staff this year. I'm not saying he was Corbin Burnes, but it was 32 appearances, 24 starts. We saw him work as a starter and a reliever. He threw 133 2/3 really strong innings for this team and posted a 3.70 ERA. Like, it was only a 7% walk rate. He didn't have an issue with that. he was pitching deeper into ball games than you see a lot of pitchers go. Like you could count on 5 strong innings and sometimes 6+ from Albert Suarez when he would go out there. He threw strikes. It was mostly high fastballs. He was kind of peppering guys with fastballs, and it was whichever of his 3 off speeds was working that day. And it's still just astounding. And who knows what they're going to get out of Albert Suarez moving forward. I mean, he's not a free agent until after 2027. So they still have 3 more years of team control of him just because of this weird contract, because he came up a while ago, went abroad, came back. Yeah, he's 35. So maybe he's not this good for the next 3 years, but you have a little bit of control of him. I don't think it could fall apart this year and he could be off the team by June. I don't think that would change how important he was to the 2024 Orioles.
Yeah, I mean, let's remember that first start that he made in April was in place of Tyler Wells, and he has 5 2/3 shutout innings, and then he comes back 5 days later on the road and has 5 2/3 shutout innings again, walks 2 batters across those 2 innings. He was so incredibly important, not just for the starting rotation, but out of the bullpen as well. I mean, rare is the pitcher that can go back and forth between the rotation and the bullpen seamlessly and not experience some kind of fatigue. I know he had thrown a lot of innings, in other countries before this season, but him ending up with 133 2/3 innings are so critical. And we know Mike Elias and Brandon Hyde, they obviously value that with their free agent signings like Kyle Gibson and Jordan Lyles. They love their innings eater. He was so much more than an innings eater because he had a 3.70 ERA, like you said, Connor, in those innings. So I think it's fascinating to see what his role is going to be with this team. But I think the fact that he was able to bounce back and forth between the rotation and the bullpen, there aren't many guys in this team that you feel confident can do that right now. Cole Irvin is not on this roster anymore. Some of the young guys that you have, like Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, Brandon Young, you could do that with, but you probably want to keep them as starters at the beginning of the year in Norfolk if they don't have a spot in Baltimore, and then maybe second half of the year you transition them to the bullpen a la DL Hall a few years ago. So the fact that they can start the year with Albert Suarez either in the rotation, depending on who they are left to acquire in free agency or via trade, or in the bullpen, just goes to show how much they valued the innings that they got from him last year and how important he could be for maybe 2025, maybe beyond. Who's to say?
Yeah, what an under the radar pickup. And for everybody who for some reason yells about minor league signings and the Orioles are playing in the scrap heap, blah, 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 blah. Like you could always get Albert Suarez out of one of those moves. Paul, to your 4th pick.
All right. Another on-field moment for me, because I have to give the Corbin Burnes wildcard start a mention here. It was a massive shame that the Orioles did not get a win in Game 1 against the Kansas City Royals, because Corbin Burnes was acquired in February to be your Nails Game 1 starter for the postseason. The Orioles were kind of, I wouldn't say they were, treating him with kid gloves, but they were very, very careful about how much they were giving him during the regular season in order to get him to October. Remember the first start of the season, they could have let him go a lot longer, and they decide, nope, opening day is not the time to use Corbin Burnes. We have him for 1 year guaranteed. We're going to get the most out of him in October. And he gave them one terrific start in the first game against the Royals. 8 innings, just 1 earned run, 5 hits, 1 walk, only 3 strikeouts, but on 84 pitches. Also was an example of just how effective Corbin Burnes can be, even though he wasn't racking up the strikeouts that he has in previous years, as my fax machine apparently goes off. I mean, somebody who obviously does not get as many swings and misses, in his current iteration, but that's okay because he gets soft contact and he gets guys out, and only needed 3 strikeouts, only threw 84 pitches. He could have pitched the 9th essentially, and the Orioles didn't muster a single run for him. He was everything. The offense did not deliver, but he was everything that they hoped he would be in his first playoff start.
Yeah, and if you remember his final start of the regular season at Yankee Stadium, the Orioles pulled him at like 60-some pitches in 5 innings. It was a 1-0 game against the Yankees. It was a game the Orioles didn't necessarily need to win. They had already clinched a playoff spot. And fans were upset. Like, what are they doing? What are they doing? And the Orioles said, hey, Burnes has been pitching a lot on 5 days rest. He's going to have to pitch on 4 days rest for this Game 1 of the wild card series. We want to make sure he's rested for that. And Orioles fans said, what do you matter about that? We're trying to beat the Yankees, blah, 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 blah. Well, he pitched into the 9th inning all year was that game one wildcard start. And a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that they held him to 60 some pitches in that start before. It's almost like the Orioles sometimes know what they are doing. And it was really cool to see him deliver in that moment. And it will stink if that is it for him in an Oriole uniform, but what a way for him to go out to give this team every chance. For my fourth pick, I'm going to pick something that I'm surprised you didn't take in the first four, but I'll take it anyway. John Angelos sells the team. I mean, that was one of the biggest storylines of 2024. Obviously, there were little bits and pieces and rumblings coming in at the end of calendar year 2023, but nothing was really made official until I believe January 31st, 2024 was that when that full report came out that he would be selling the team to David Rubenstein of the Carlyle Group for almost $2 billion. And Orioles fans rejoiced. And I kind of am drafting everything that has to do with it, not just the sale of the team. I'm not going to relitigate everything I've said about John Angelos before. That is in the past. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know my thoughts on that and the detriment that he was to the Orioles organization, but also the fact that it wasn't just David Rubenstein buying the team. It was David Rubenstein, who was a Baltimore native. David Rubenstein, who becomes on the richer side of owners in Major League Baseball. David Rubenstein, who spent $21 million for a copy of the Magna Carta just to donate it to a museum. Like a guy who seems to have a little bit of disposable income, and a guy who's older in his 70s and has said all the right things so far that he wants to spend on this baseball team and turn it into a World Series winner because he's not going to be here for that long owning this team, especially at his age, growing up an Orioles fan. And not only that, being at so many games, donning his Orioles gear, walking around the concourse, throwing hats to fans in the crowd. Like he has done everything. Michael Arrighetti being at Pickles on opening day and just introducing himself, as he's kind of the number two, it would seem, ownership wise right now, and buying everyone a beer and Pickles that day. Like these are just easy things. And I know you are a Philly native, Paul, and you know about like a pandering owner. Middleton might be the best pandering owner in Major League Baseball. Now he backs it up by spending his money and putting together a really good baseball team. And we haven't quite seen it, obviously, at that level from Rubenstein and the Orioles yet, but like he has gone out there and said all the right things, done all the right things in terms of a PR perspective for the Orioles. Now, next up is, are they going to offer up a big extension or a big contract? And that remains to be seen. But David Rubenstein coming in and kind of flipping this thing on its head was quite the breath of fresh air for Orioles and Orioles fans really in 2024.
So the reason I didn't draft the change in ownership is because I am still waiting to see what is going to change in terms of the payroll. And I think it's awesome that Michael Arrighetti, that David Rubenstein, I think it's awesome that Cal Ripken joined the ownership group. I think it's great to have somebody that Orioles fans can connect with, that they know is going to handle this franchise with care, that cares about the people, cares about Maryland, cares about Baltimore. I think Cal Ripken Jr.'s inclusion in that group is critical. I just want to see the payroll increase, and I want to see the ability of this front office to spend, maybe not with the Yankees, maybe not with the Mets, but spend more than they have been. And I just have not seen it yet. I think it's great that they're making public appearances, and I'm not saying that they won't be increasing their payroll massively over the coming off seasons. However, until I see proof in the pudding that this ownership group is really willing to put their money where their mouth is, I'm not quite ready to draft them in this in terms of favorite things. But that doesn't mean that an Adley Rutschman extension couldn't come out of the blue tomorrow, or they couldn't go out and sign and extend somebody, or trade for and extend somebody that we don't see coming, and all of a sudden their payroll balloons. I still do think from everything that we've heard that is coming, but look back a year ago. I look back at Scott Boras's comments last December at the winter meetings, and he said Orioles front office, Orioles ownership is reaching out to him almost every day about extending Gunnar Henderson. And then a couple weeks later, the team is sold. So I still have yet to see an example of this Orioles ownership do something massive in terms of increasing the payroll. That doesn't mean it won't happen. I just am reserving my judgment until I see it happen.
Completely fair point. But I think people who have listened to this podcast know that it got so bad with John Angelos that any kind of change was a good change. And obviously that next level, that's why it wasn't number one for me at least. But that next level, we are still kind of waiting for. We've each got one more draft pick in this draft, and then we'll talk about some of our honorable mentions, our runners up, things on the big board. But that is coming up after our final break. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is focused on togetherness this holiday season. That means when you bring people together at live events, the experience is that much better, and it's the perfect gift. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Now, no baseball tickets being bought on Game Time for a little while now, but if you want to check out some basketball, some hockey, some football, the Ravens 1 win away from clinching the AFC North. You can go grab some tickets over at Game Time, but maybe baseball is your sport. Maybe in the off season, it's off of the sports landscape. I get that too. Game Time Picks, the curation, still makes it easy to save more on not just sports, but also concerts, comedy, theater, and more. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So we are here with Paul Mancano of the Baltimore Banner, drafting our favorite Orioles things from 2024, and a little bit longer episode than usual, but there's a lot to talk about in this season, despite it being a little bit of a disappointing ending. And Paul, so far, we'll kind of recap your whole five once you make your fifth selection. So I'll just swing it over to you for your fifth and final selection of this draft.
Sure. And you gave me the example of this when you were pitching me this idea, Connor. You said we could draft anything. We could draft, for example, the Zach Eflin trade. And I'm going to take it right here with my fifth and final pick, because right now, we are only a few months after the trade was made, but right now it looks like a home run for Mike Elias. The Orioles deal 3 prospects to their Tampa Bay Rays. They deal Jackson Baumeister, Matthew Etzel, and Mac Horvath to the Rays on July 26th for Zach Eflin. And he proceeds to come to Baltimore and have a 2.60 ERA in 9 regular season starts, has a solid start in game 2 of the wild card series against Kansas City. And he's under contract for another season. That was probably the best part of this entire deal. It's not like they got a rental in Zach Eflin. He's somebody that slots in right now, probably either on opening day or right behind Grayson Rodriguez on opening day for 2025. And he's just 30 years old. So a guy who has tremendous upside as a top end of the rotation guy. And the 3 players that they gave up certainly have high upside, but they are a ways away from the big leagues. It is a stark contrast to the Trevor Rogers deal, which was head scratching to me at the time. I still don't fully understand it, where they gave up Connor Norby and Kyle Stowers. The 3 prospects in Baumeister, Etzel, and Horvath, all highly drafted players by the Orioles. The one that scares me perhaps the most about coming back and haunting the Orioles is Jackson Baumeister, because he was kind of a lottery pick when they took him at the second round. He was great for the Orioles in high A in 2024, and he was also great in high A for the Rays after they traded him. Whereas Etzel and Horvath, I'm not sure there was ever room for those guys in Baltimore because of the Orioles' depth position player-wise. But you gave up an interesting lottery pick in Jackson Baumeister. However, all worth it to get a year and a half of Zach Eflin.
This was the only pick you sniped me on. This was also my number 5 selection, so I will have to move down the board a little bit more. I like this trade for multiple reasons. One was I felt smart from this trade because when I was identifying guys for the Orioles to go and trade for, Eflin was number 2 on my wish list at the deadline for starting pitchers that were more than rentals. I was so in love with what the Rays were able to do with Zach Eflin, and he had his moments, certainly, with the Phillies. Some of those out of the bullpen, some as a starter, more out of the bullpen, really. But what the Rays were able to do with him in the rotation, I mean, the guy is allergic to walks. With the Orioles, he walked 5% of batters, and that was, he doubled his walk rate from the Rays to the Orioles, and it was still only at 5%, like absurdly low walk rates. It's this huge kitchen sink approach pitch mix, and nothing's overpowering. He, the Rays and the Orioles helped him strike out a few more batters and really rely on his cutter, which the Orioles felt was his best pitch, and that really did work out for him. But 9 starts, 55 in the third innings, a 2.60 ERA for Eflin with the Orioles. That was clearly the best performance after the deadline of any starter that was traded at the deadline last year. Like, the Orioles got the best starter who was dealt at the deadline. The only guy I think who probably came close was what Yusei Kikuchi did for the Astros. And his ERA was still a run higher with Houston than what Eflin did for Baltimore. So although the Trevor Rogers trade might have been a little bit of a panic move, the Eflin trade might have been the best deal of the deadline for what the Orioles got out of it. And again, as you mentioned, it wasn't just a rental. They get him for all of 2025 and really didn't give up a lot. And the other part I liked about this trade is, again, we haven't seen the big move from ownership, but this was ownership saying, yes, Zach Eflin is owed $18 million next year. We don't care. Throw it on the books. Like, that is not a trade the Orioles would have made in the past to take on a guy who was due $18 million. And at that point, was going to become the Orioles' highest paid player in 2025. Like, that's not something they would have gone for, and they did it, and he was a huge addition. And as you said, like, I wouldn't be surprised. I would rather than make another move to get someone better than him, but I would not be surprised if Zach Eflin gets the ball on opening day 2025, and that's just how well he ended up pitching down the stretch. So you took my Eflin pick. So I'm going to take the one that ended up being number 6 on my big board. And this is kind of all-encompassing, so I'm going to talk about a couple of things. My final pick is just the Orioles' performance against the Yankees this year. Now, I know the Yankees won the division by a couple games, and they clinched it up with that final win against the Orioles in September. And yes, the Yankees were the better baseball team. They won the division. They went to the World Series. The Orioles didn't win the division. The Orioles were out in the wild card round. But the Orioles did go 8-5 against the Yankees this year, and it kind of felt like they dominated this season series. Some of the highlights: bludgeoning the Yankees 17-5 on June 20th at Yankee Stadium to win a series there. Now, the offense kind of started moving the other direction the next day and never kind of got itself back together. But that was the peak of this Orioles offensive season. Like, 17 runs, 20 hits, 7 walks, destroying Luis Gil, who somehow also pitched in the big leagues in 2021 and won the Rookie of the Year award in 2024. Either way, they destroyed him. He pitched like 2 innings that day. You've got the Cedric Mullins walk-off the day before the All-Star break, where Craig Kimbrell kind of had his, kind of the beginning of the end for Craig Kimbrell right there, was that slip-up in the 9th inning. And then, speaking of slip-ups, Alex Verdugo forgets how to use his legs, and Cedric Mullins hits one over his head for a walk-off after Anthony Volpe forgot how to field a ground ball right before it. That was a very satisfying walk-off win that kept the Orioles in first place heading into the All-Star break. I mean, you've got a multitude of Yankee moments. There was a series early in the year at Oriole Park where the O's won 3 of 4, where they were without Kimbrell. It was right after he had suffered the bad weekend against the A's and then had the back issue. And there was one game where Jacob Webb got a save against the Yankees in which he struck out Giancarlo Stanton with a sweeper that I swear was so far outside it went beyond the left-handed batter's box and was further outside than the entire batter's box, and Stanton still swung through it for a strikeout. Like, that was a really good moment against the Yankees. Obviously, the Orioles clinched their playoff berth with a win against the Yankees in September. Like, there were some really good moments for the O's against New York this year. And to go 8-5 against a team that went to the World Series, have so many cool moments against them, I thought was one of the defining points of this Orioles season.
Was it 2019 into 2020 that the Yankees beat the Orioles? I think it was 18 straight times. And they finally, it feels like not that long ago that the Orioles simply could not beat the New York Yankees. And I know the Orioles didn't win the division this year and the Yankees did, but there were some iconic moments in those 2 series. And one draft pick that I didn't get to make in this, Connor, was when they had that benches clearing brawl in July. And Brandon Hyde kind of sparked that. He was holding onto a batting helmet and he fires it away and he starts pointing into the Yankees dugout. That was right after Heston Kjerstad unfortunately got his concussion, and that kind of derailed his season, for a month or 2. But Brandon Hyde sticking up for his guys, and there actually being some kind of fire between these 2 teams is exciting. The Yankees have viewed the Orioles as the little brother in the AL East for a while. I think 2023 kind of wisened them up to say, hey, the Orioles are here to play. And now that they actually, have maybe a little bit of bad blood, I kind of like that.
Yeah, it was cool to see them, despite the Yankees obviously getting to the World Series. It was cool to see what the Orioles did against them. So that is our draft. So Paul, read out your 5 selections for us. Who did you take in your draft?
So I took leadoff Gunnar Henderson. I took James McCann's broken nose game. I took the Jackson Holiday Grand Slam. I took Corbin Burnes' wild card start. And finally, I took the Zach Eflin trade with my 5 picks.
I got the Anthony Santander go-ahead Grand Slam against the Astros in August. I took the Corbin Burnes trade. I took everything about Albert Suarez's season. I took the Orioles ownership change, and I took the Orioles performance against the Yankees this year. So please, if you're listening or watching on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, let us know in the comments here on YouTube, whose draft class do you like better? Who won this draft? Let us know if it's Connor or if it's Paul, and let us know why. But Paul, before we go, if there's a few things on your big board left, if we want to just go back and forth rapid fire, just one thing on your big board you didn't get to pick and one sentence about it if you want to start it off.
Sure. Well, one, I had the yeet heard around the world, which was when Colton Cowser in Kansas City yeeted the Craig Kimbrell ball over his head into the fountains and then had somebody dig it out and then had to put it in rice in Craig Kimbrell's locker. That was an awesome moment. The second one that I didn't get to pick was the Heston Kjerstad steak analogy. Do you remember after the trade deadline when Austin Hayes got traded and they asked Heston Kjerstad his thoughts on it? And he said, quote, "It's like when you go to dinner, you buy a steak, you trade the steakhouse a $100 bill for a steak. You know you're getting a good value. The steakhouse says they're getting a good value. That's the way it is with teams." That was my favorite analogy possible to describe trades in baseball. I don't know why he's paying cash at a steakhouse, but just phenomenal. I thought somebody could have drafted the live hot dog races. The fact that the Orioles incorporated that into their game day experience. And finally, the Kevin Brown contract extension that we got earlier this year to keep him in Baltimore long term, I think was key. What were some of the picks that you didn't get to make today, Connor?
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Colton Cowser. We didn't get to him except for the yeet, obviously. Just like the entire mooing of it all, cow suits, the mooing in the stadium, the fact that he was a top 5 hitter in baseball in April and then did enough the rest of the year to, I think, earn a Gold Glove and a Rookie of the Year, in which he finished second in both of them because of the haters in the BBWAA. But he was, I mean, you look at his month of April specifically, he had a 182 WRC plus. He was the 6th best hitter in baseball that month. It was like, wow, we got a stud here. The only Orioles who had better months all year were Gunnar Henderson in June and Anthony Santander in July. Those were the only better months that any Oriole had all season. Like, it was a rough debut in 23, highlighted by those 2 homers in Boston in April, where he hit the one over the monster and then swung at that 3-0 pitch in extra innings and hit a ball like basically all the way out to Rhode Island. That was absurd what he did. And it was just cool to see him come into his own as a really important piece for this team moving forward this year. I had to take Jordan Westburg making the All-Star team. Like, people finding out who Jordan Westburg is, like, that was awesome. And it stunk losing him. Like, he had a 125 WRC plus this year in 107 games. He deserved that All-Star bid. And the Orioles had a 121 team WRC plus through July 31st. That was the best offense in baseball through July 31st. He breaks his hand on the 31st. From August 1st through September 21st, they went down to a 98 WRC plus. That was 17th in baseball. Jordan Westburg returns on September 22nd. From the 22nd through the end of the season, a 129 team WRC plus was 3rd in baseball. It is hard to state how important Jordan Westburg was to this offense this year and how much they floundered without him in there. So I just wanted to give him a shout out for everything he did. One of the things I will miss most about Anthony Santander is him bringing in Brandon Quinones to a post-game interview, saying, "my man," and then proceeding to do the whole interview in English anyway while Brandon stands there. Yep. Like, that is one of my favorite interview moments every single time it happens. And shout out to Santander. Be interesting to see who Sugano's translator becomes, and if we get some cool moments with that this year. The other ones that I had on my big board, you picked some of them: the Holiday Grand Slam, the McCann Bloody Nose. Keegan Aiken being good somehow, I had on here down on the list. I was never going to draft it, but it was cool. 5 home runs off Zach Wheeler on Father's Day was awesome. A cool on-field moment for the Orioles. Mopping the Rays in June, where they won 4 games at the Trop and allowed 4 or 7 runs in 4 games. And then I got to shout out, like, this is a cool inside baseball moment. You joked about it earlier, but David Banuelos doing the thankless job of being the taxi squad catcher / basically 3rd bullpen catcher all year. For the Orioles to get him into a game on April 16th and allow him to get an at-bat, make his major league debut, like, he never get back into a game again. He's 30. He's like a 4th catcher at this point, but that was a really, really cool moment for him. And it was interesting to see that the Orioles pretty much immediately after the season ended, re-signed him to another minor league deal, not because of on-field performance, because they probably loved him in that clubhouse, in that role. If you're going to re-sign a guy to a minor league deal, who had one at bat for you and didn't produce in AAA when he was playing that quickly, you can tell how much of an impact that guy must have made in that Oriole clubhouse, and definitely cool for him to get on the field. But that was kind of the rest of my big board. Those were things down the list that I was like, this is never getting into a top 5, but felt like needed some shout outs about this Orioles season.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about Ramon Urias having 5 homers in the month of August, a season after he had 4 homers the entire season long.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of those moments that you shouted out were everything with Anthony Santander and Q was just delightful, and I really worry about Q being able to move on without him, assuming Anthony Santander leaves in free agency, because those two were really tight. And Colton Cowser absolutely deserves plenty of praise for the kind of season that he had. And weirdly, the moment I think about with Colton Cowser, probably recency bias, the home run at Yankee Stadium, it was either in the clinching game or the game after the clinching game, where he just hit an absolute rocket to right field, and he just rocks back on his heels and admires it for a second. That was just a phenomenal moment for him, and what a year that he had. So lot to look back on. It's just a fun exercise to look back on and remember some of the moments, even though, a lot of Orioles fans will look back on this season, like you said, with a little bit of a sour taste in their mouth. There was so much to be excited for during the entire season.
Yeah, we got to finish it off with the longest episode of the year, and I can't do the longest episode of the year
sorry.
without Paul Mancano on here. No, listen, what else are we doing?
Yeah,
what else are we
exactly.
doing here? We're talking Orioles.
No,
well, before we close out here, got to make the longest episode of the year longer. I want to give you out there listening, or you out there watching, a chance to tell us your favorite Orioles moment of the year. Thank you all for helping me get above 8,000 subscribers on YouTube. As you know, if you've been listening to this show, every 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, we do a giveaway. So we are giving away an Orioles Hawaiian shirt. You can see it there. Paul, how festive and fancy and stylish.
Beautiful.
Let me tell you, by the Baltimore Banner's Paul Mancano.
Oh yeah,
right there.
I have my closet. I moved recently, as you know, Connor, and I had to decide how many of those Hawaiian shirts I was going to take with me, and I decided all of them. I mean, that's like 90% of my closet.
Correct choice.
Because my friends come to visit. They come to Orioles games, and if they're from out of town, they don't have Orioles gear, and I just throw them Hawaiian shirts, and we all wear them.
Perfect. Very stylish. There it is. Orioles Hawaiian shirt. Not sure what year this one's from, but it will be given away. You have to do 2 things to enter the giveaway. 1, subscribe to the Locked On Orioles podcast on YouTube. And 2, leave a comment in any video from yesterday until January 31st, until December 31st, until the new year, telling me what is your favorite Orioles moment of 2024. It could be one of the ones we talked about today. It could be something different. Just again, subscribe and put in the comment section here on YouTube your favorite Orioles moment of 2024, and we will draw the winners after the new year of this very stylish Orioles Hawaiian shirt. Well, Paul, just under an hour, that'll do it. Before we go, let people know where they can find your work at the Baltimore Banner, what they can expect. I know it's more Ravens season for you right now, which makes sense, but any of your Orioles or all your work over at the Banner, where they can find it.
Yeah, we're still doing Banner baseball shows. Me, John Mioli, sometimes Danielle Allentuck, sometimes Andy Koska. I did steal one of your guests from the Locked On Orioles podcast that you'll have to hear on the most recent episode of the Banner Baseball Show, which you can find anywhere that you get your podcasts. And of course, you got to subscribe to the Baltimore Banner, $1 for 6 months. I also run at All Banner Sports on X and Blue Sky and all of those favorite social media platforms. So find me wherever you can get any kind of sports content.
Catch Paul doing Baltimore sports TikToks as well on the Banner TikTok account, as I plugged at the beginning. As I've said before, the Banner is my #1 spot for all Orioles coverage. Danielle, John, Andy, and of course Paul over there, and Kyle Goon as well, doing a fantastic job.
Kyle's name.
Gotta get Kyle in there, doing a fantastic job covering the Orioles. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Have a happy new year. That'll do it for this episode and this week on the podcast. We will be back next week to continue covering everything around the hot stove. Everybody kind of took a break for the holiday, but just before we recorded, Gleyber Torres is out of the AL East. Finally, he is signed with the Detroit Tigers. Hopefully that kicks off some more signings and maybe some Orioles moves as we get closer to the new year. We'll recap any of that coming up when I am back on Monday's episode. But until then, he's Paul Mancano, and I am Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.